this is Manhattan Island. But, I have to say, when I moved to New York City and started to learn about this incredible place, I couldn't help but wonder, well, what was this place like beforehand? I mean, it hasn't always been like this, of course, and that led to about 10 years' work to reconstruct what Manhattan Island was like 400 years ago, um, as if it were a few moments before Henry Hudson arrived. And the few moments before is important to me because we sort of think of the history of New York City as starting with the Europeans and then developing forward. But that's to neglect the history of the land and all the other ways of living on this land that is so much longer in time, and in some ways goes back to the beginning of the earth itself. Um, so this image I'm showing you here is our reconstruction of what Manhattan, or Mannahatta as it was called at the time, might have looked like on the afternoon of September 12th, 1609. And you can see Henry Hudson's ship there. And we know from our research that this island had about 54 different ecosystem types, 54, 55, over 1,000 different species. The human beings have been living here for 8,000 years before Hudson showed up. And the Lenape culture for maybe 1,000 years before Hudson arrived. And that's not just true for Manhattan, that's true for the rest of the city. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Bronx before Bronx, if you like. And I'd like to say Welikia Minowitz. Welikia is a Lenape word. It's like a greeting word. It means a welcome. It's what you'd say to someone when they came to your, to your camp or your wigwam. You would say Welikia, and Minowitz is one version of the Lenape name or the Sewanoi name, the Native American name for City Island. So that's like saying hello, City Island. And this work that's extending from the Mannahatta project, we call the Welikia project, because we want people to think like that this is a really great place to live, and a great place to live because of all of the things that happened before it, before Europeans arrived. So I'll talk a little bit about the Mannahatta project, just to give you an idea of the process, because that one is fully worked out. We're still working on the Welikia stuff. And then I'll talk specifically about what City Island was like in pre-European times. So just to give you a little bit more background about me, I grew up in California, like Barbara said, and when I was a teenager, there was nothing I liked to do more than the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas of California. When it became time for me to do graduate studies, I was really interested in this brand new field called landscape ecology. And landscape ecology is the idea that, like if we look at the picture on the left, that there's a mosaic of ecosystems, that the stream is an ecosystem, the meadow is an ecosystem, the forest is an ecosystem. And if we were a bird flying over, that they would form a certain pattern. And that pattern is essential for everything that lives there, for all the plants and animals that live there. If the pattern doesn't work for them, then it's not going to be a habitat for them. And that's true for people too. And once you sort of get that idea in your mind, you start to see the world in terms of these landscape patterns. So as I was driving across the country, I stopped at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, and there is a completely different set of ecosystems, but it also has a very distinct landscape pattern to it. And much to my surprise, like caring about landscape pattern got me a job at the Bronx Zoo. Not working with the wildlife in the zoo, with the animals in the zoo, but working to save animals all around the world, the kinds of animals you see in the zoo, but working with my colleagues in over 60 countries around the world on wildlife conservation. And I'll say part of the reason I was attracted to come back east is because some of the founders of WCS included Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt is the person who had set aside a lot of that land in California that I grew up loving as a young person. And when I first started at the zoo, I would literally walk up to the steps of the administration building in the morning to my little office up in the upper reaches in the back corner. I think, I'm literally walking on the steps of Teddy Roosevelt. How cool is that? So like I said, most of my professional work is not about New York City, but it's about critters other places: jaguars, spectacled bears, rhinos. I've been to more than 40 countries around the world working with wildlife conservationists. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful career. But it always brings me back to New York. No, especially the first couple of years when I was living on City Island, I would, I'd fly to Africa or I would fly to someplace in Asia and I'd spend a few weeks there and then I would fly back. And then on the weekends, I would go down to Manhattan as a tourist. And I took this picture actually that first summer from the top of the Empire State Building. And, I would think about this, like, isn't this a landscape of a kind? It has a pattern, it has a set of ecosystems, but, maybe now the ecosystems are buildings and streets and highways. And if you look in the distance, you can see the East River and some of the green spaces. And, somehow it's in a certain pattern and that pattern makes mosaic and that mosaic makes it possible for some plants and animals to live here and for people to live here and not for others. And it just seemed to me like these ideas about landscape ecology could apply to the city as well as to a wild place. And then that thought led to this, this sort of strange thing about New York City, um, which is, if you go to most great cities around the world, London or Paris or Tokyo or Delhi, um, you know, all those cities you feel part of this historical progression, right? Like it's very clear people came before you, and then you're here, and then people will come after you, and that you're part of this, and that's part of what you celebrate when you go to those cities. Um, what you do, you go to the Tower of London to imagine what it'll be like to be, to be there with the, Henry VIII. New York, we don't really do that. In New York, it's really all about the future. And yet there's so many things about New York that you can't explain except with reference to the past. So this is another kind of tourist photo from that time down in Times Square. And, the woman on the marquee. But of course, there's this guy, Father Duffy, a priest, standing right in the middle of Times Square. And we wouldn't actually have Times Square in the way we do and the way we understand it if it wasn't for his efforts, which is why there's a statue to him. So and it just occurred to me that there's something really interesting about the way we think about our lives here in New York City, and that there's something really interesting to be dug into about the past. Um, and once you start seeing the city in that way, you start to see there's all kinds of evidence everywhere, including natural history, like these, Manhattan schist rock outcrops in Central Park. Some of these are almost 1 billion years old. They're really, really old pieces of rock, older than life on Earth, especially, kind of multicellular life. Um, and, they've been at the base of mountain ranges. They've been, mountain ranges that's the height of the Himalayas on top of these rocks that then have gone away. And then the other mountains raised up and have gone away, and these rocks still abide. It turns out Mannahatta, one of the interpretations of that name is that it means island of many hills. And if you think of the buildings of the city as a kind of hill, then in a way, we have more hills than we ever did before. And then in the context of this, I read about, the history of New York. It's the first megacity, the first city of 10 million people or more ever in the entire history of humanity back in 1950. And now there's 28 megacities around the world. So it just struck me that New York's history is very important in that context as a place with really dense human habitation from very early on. And when you start to look for it, you see all kinds of wonderful things like this image from the Museum of the City of New York showing the beach along the Hudson River, looking up toward Washington Heights where the George Washington Bridge goes across. This is from 1841. Or this picture down from Lower Manhattan. This is a hill in Greenwich Village overlooking a valley looking back toward New York City from the 1760s. And I would like go on my weekend and try and find that hill or try and find that valley. And, they're just not there anymore. They're just not there anymore. So, and what happened to them and what are the consequences of them going away? So something else that sort of tweaked me about this work, and the thing that really got me started is looking into the really fantastic collection of historical maps that we have of New York City. And I'll show you some of these of City Island. This is Manhattan. This is the famous British headquarters map from 1782, made by British military cartographers during the American Revolution. And you can see that those little pink blocks on the left, it's sort of Manhattan on its side. Those little pink blocks on the left, that's the city in 1782. And then you can see the hills and the streams and the valleys and the beaches and the wetlands north of that. And I thought, well, how come nobody's ever talking about that? the names of these things. And as I did more research, I realized that all of these hills have names, and all of the streams and all of the wetlands. Some of them have a Lenape name, we know, and then they have Dutch names, and then they'll have English names, and then a detailed history of when they were filled in and built over. Part of what we do in landscape ecology is use all kinds of spatial data resources like this, and we georeference them in the computer so that we can compare other data that's in the same space, but maybe from a different time. So this is showing the way the modern road network falls on top of lower Manhattan. So this process is called georeferencing or rectification, and we do it for these historical sources, and that allows us to actually trace the features on the map and then relate them to the modern geography of the city. And we do this, for the British headquarters map, for other maps, in the case of Wailikya, it's well over 300 maps nowadays that we've looked at. And from them, we derive, basic facts about the landscape ecology, the streams, the hills, the soil types, the depth under the water. And then from that, we build models of where the ecosystems were, hemlock hardwood forest and grasslands and ponds and oak pine forests. For a number of years, one of my hobbies is to leave New York City in September and go take pictures of the kinds of ecosystems that used to be in New York City. And within about 75 miles of New York, including this place not very far from here called Pelham Bay Park, you can see sort of remnant examples of really fantastic ecosystems. Just an extraordinary diversity of ecosystems in this landscape. All to be appreciated and loved, including the kinds of ecosystems that people make. And so, as part of this, I became really interested in who the Native Americans were and what they were doing, and how they understood the land, how they interacted with it. My wife works at the New York Botanical Garden, and for a number of years, my son and I built this wigwam in the family garden there. And the kids really loved, but for me, it was also kind of an experiment about, how do you build a wigwam? And to think like living, for that being your structure, that being your place, 15 feet across, it makes our city island residences look like mansions, or the apartments downtown look like, huge spaces. These are the Lenape people and the Swanoi people, these sort of coastal Algonquin folks that lived all up and down the Northeast. The Lenape in particular were from sort of what we think is eastern Pennsylvania, across New Jersey and into the southeastern corner of New York. And then somewhere in the middle of the Bronx, they moved over to the Swanoi, who had a very similar kind of lifestyle. These people lived a sort of hunting, gathering, and horticultural lifestyle. So they had the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So they grew some of their own food, but they also hunted and fished and collected clams, oysters from the local waters. They made wampum belts that the Dutch came and thought, oh, that's money. I see what you're doing. That's money. But these were not money at all in the way that Europeans thought of it. They were sort of customary gift goods. They were ways of marking respect to each other, because they just took so long to make. So these three sisters garden, and my wife and I had, for a long time, were growing corn, beans, and squash at the New York Botanical Garden every year, which was super fun. This is a really wonderful kind of horticulture where the Lenape would have cleared a patch of forest big enough for what they needed for their encampment, and then they would have made mounds, and then in the mounds they would have planted corn kind of in late April, and then let it grow to it's maybe 6 or 8 inches high. And then they would plant beans, these sort of climbing beans that then would climb on the corn. So this is a kind of symbiosis between the corn and the beans, where the corn is providing a scaffold to get up to the sun, and the beans are providing their nitrogen fixing. So they're providing fertilizer to the corn. And then it's a little hard to see in this picture, but they would plant squash between the mounds. And squash, have these big old leaves. And so what we discovered is if you maintain this garden through about the end of June, then you don't have to do anything else for the rest of the year, because the squash covers the ground. It helps keep the rainwater in. It keeps the weeds down. And then you get these 3 crops, beans, corn, and squash, which you can dry and then keep until the wintertime. So if you don't want to go hunting or you don't want to wade out into Eastchester Bay in the middle of winter to get yourself some oysters, you can eat, succotash and beans instead. The only problem with this kind of garden is the squirrels love it too, and the Lenape would have left their kids to sleep in the fields during the summertime, but the botanical garden wouldn't let me leave my son there, so we had a big fight every year with the squirrels. So in this way, the Lenape, and the Sawanoi, they were disturbing the landscape. They would have these camps, and then they would have these active fields, and they would grow their food for 20, 25, 30 years, and then eventually the soils would be depleted, and then they would abandon it and make a new active field. And so the old field would become an old field, which is a kind of ecosystem in itself, is sort of grassy, shrubby ecosystem. We would think of these as kind of weedy spots, but in fact, they are really important these kind of open meadow ecosystems in the closed canopy forest. And then eventually those would close in as shrublands and eventually go back to forest. And the kind of forest, of course, depends on the soil and the topography and distance from the water and so forth. And so, you would, by using a set of ecological techniques and models built on this historical data, we could sort of reconstruct what the landscape was like, and what the neighborhoods were like. I always think of these different ecological communities as like our neighborhoods. And in the same way that people come to City Island to eat food and they know kind of what they're going to get when they come here, Lenape would have gone to a tulip tree forest to get a certain kind of food, or gone to an oak hickory forest to get something, or gone down to the beach to get something else. And think that was the way it was for thousands of years in New York City. That's the way people knew this very same landscape. No streets, no avenues, no cars, just trees and woods and beautiful waters. And full of other kinds of things, chicken mushroom and over 600 species of flowering plants and 85 species of fish, freshwater fishes and saltwater fishes and the diadromous fishes going back and forth. And all kinds of birds, over 350 species of birds, most of which are still around, although not this particular species. This is the heath hen, which is a eastern grassland specialist that went extinct in the 1920s. Beavers, there would have been beavers on almost every stream in New York City once upon a time. And beavers dam streams, that's what they do, which creates habitat for some species and destroys it for others. And they don't really mean to, that's what they do. And I often think this is a good model for human beings, which is that, we destroy habitat for a lot of species, probably for the most part without really meaning to. We're just thinking about ourselves. We're not thinking about anybody else. Of course, the big difference between us and a beaver is the beaver really only has one choice. They really only have one trick, which is to cut down trees and build dams. Whereas our whole life history is about making choices and about creating the world that we want to live in, not just the world that we're forced to live in, which is why things like urban conservation are so interesting. It's sort of rethinking what it means to live in the city. There's also big wildlife around here: wolves and black bear, mountain lion, catamount, whales and porpoises in the harbor, sharks. I mean, really, really abundant wildlife. So much so that I've said, a little bit tongue in cheek, but if we'd settled the country, if Asian people had come and settled in California and then moved east, and by the time they got east, they might have decided, well, maybe we should set aside a national park. And they might have set aside Manhattan or City Island as a national park because it would have been such a rich and abundant place to live. So then, there was a point in the project where we'd done all this work on the maps, we'd done all this work on the species, and we wanted to put them together. And I'm going to sort of short circuit the story a little bit, but the way to do that was with these habitat networks, or mirror webs, as we call them. And what we're looking at here is a realization of all the habitat connections of all the plants and animals that used to live in Manhattan, and we've extended this now for the rest of the city. For each one of those little points is a different plant or animal, and each of the gray lines is a different habitat connection to something else in the ecosystem. And when you zoom out, it looks like, looks like this. It looks like a big ball of string, but this big ball of string is actually a representation of what makes nature strong and robust. It's actually why complex networks have this ability to adapt and to be resilient. Arguably, that's what cities have too, which is this ability to adapt and to be resilient, because they are this like densely connected set of diverse elements that all need each other in some fundamental way. Yeah, so we created a website, which eventually is going to be citywide. Right now, it's still just focused on Manhattan, but allows you to zoom to any block and double click on that block and get a list of all the plants and animals that live on that block. So someday you'll be able to do that for the blocks of City Island, as well as the surrounding waters. And like Barbara said, so this led to my book, which I was very gratified. Was completely surprised, by the way, that it was a bestseller. I didn't think everybody was going to think it was so cool as I did. National Geographic wrote about it in 2009, in the September 2009 issue. So ever since then, ever since 2009, so now it's 2020, so it's 11 years later. And we've been expanding over the rest of the city. So this is a map of the historical elevations and depths under the water, the topography and the bathymetry for the whole city. And in fact, we've expanded this even more to make this sort of round shape. It's about a 30-kilometer area around around the center of New York City. And you can see City Island up there in the upper right-hand corner. We'll be talking about that more shortly. And then for the whole city, we then compile data sets from maps for all the streams. And this has actually been a lot more work than I anticipated it was going to be when I started in 2010 and 2011. From Manhattan, we had that British headquarters map. It taught us maybe 80% of what we needed to know, and then we could fill in with other resources. That's not true for the rest of the city. There's no one map that maps the historical ecology of the city. So we've literally been through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of maps and georeferenced a couple hundred of them to compile the data you're seeing here. All the springs, all the ponds, the wetlands, the salt marshes, and the freshwater wetlands. And also a really intensive effort to document the native occupation of the city by the Lenape and the Swanoi people. So trying to compile all the archaeological literature and all the historical observations, and there's a lot of work, and just like trying to figure out how they fit together and how they fit together on the landscape. So this part of the work is practically done, although one of the things about New York City is it's almost infinitely deep. Whenever you dig a little bit deeper, you find new things. So even 11 years later, I'm still finding out about new stuff. And we also do this process where we try and map the names. We have a database where we collect little quotes out of the historical sources, little descriptions of different parts of the city, different names, hills, streams, shoreline points, Native American sites, and so forth. And then we compile that and put them back on the maps so that we can put the textual evidence with the cartographic evidence to kind of triangulate what the features were like in the past. So, okay, so that was maybe a long background. I just wanted to, I didn't know how much of you know about the work that I do, and I just wanted to fill you in about that. So what about this place? What about this place, City Island? Here I'm going to actually go to the GIS and show you some maps, and then show you some of the layers we've compiled. And then I'll come back to the PowerPoint and then show you some images of what we've reconstructed of City Island. Sorry, this is a big file, takes a second to load. There we go. Here's the City Island version. So there's some really wonderful historical maps that I know Barbara knows about, but I'll share a little bit of this with you. First to say, let me just orient you what we're looking at here. So this will just load in a second. So we're going to talk about City Island out here in the Eastern Bronx and Long Island Sound, which you can see here. So this is City Island, right? And this is Hart Island. And what we're showing is the digital elevation model, which shows the elevation above the land. So the yellows and brown colors are elevation above sea level, and the blue to darker blue, these are depths under the sea level. And we get this information by looking at these historical maps. So let me show you this one first. This is a map from 1776. It's by a man named Charles Blaskowitz, who worked for the British military, and he made a map. And this map is about the British chasing George Washington out of New York and up in the White Plains. So, and it's actually kind of a story map. It starts over here with this landing in October of 1776. This is one of the British ships, and these are the little boats landing at Throg's Neck. And they march up the road. You can see the troops marching up the road here on Throg's Neck. And they get here to Westchester and Westchester Creek, and they can't get across because the American revolutionaries start shooting them here. And so then they march over here, and they march over here around Ware Creek. And then they have to come back. They march back down here and get back on their boats and then sail around Frog Point or Throg's Neck, right? He didn't really know what the names were, so he was kind of making it up as he goes. And they come over here and they land at what we know of as Rodman's Neck and Turtle Cove. And they start trying to chase the revolutionaries here, and then they get stopped again over here at Glover's Rock, which you can know over by Pelham Bay Park. In the meantime, while this is all going on, and there's this famous battle with Colonel John Glover from the Marblehead militia who comes down, and they're able to hold back the British for most of a morning, which allows George Washington to escape through the central part of Westchester, or what we call the Bronx now. Meanwhile, some of the men went over here to New City Island, and they burned the buildings, and they stole a couple of cows, which we know from the old records. So this doesn't actually give us a lot of geographic specificity about City Island, but it's a fun story that connects with the history, and it shows you like these wetlands. Like this wetland is where Turtle Cove is today, and it used to go right along basically the Orchard Beach Road, and this over here, this is Pelham Bay, and so this is where Orchard Beach is, right? Long before Orchard Beach was constructed, and this here would be Rodman's Neck. Okay, so that's 1776. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. This is a map of the Bronx from 1781, and it doesn't actually show us anything about City Island except for this little label over here. This map is it's fascinating because it's really detailed over on the western part of the Bronx. This is another British map, and that's because the British sort of controlled this area. But as they got over to the eastern part of the Bronx, they didn't control anything. And during the American Revolution, the Bronx was kind of this no man's land where there were terrible things actually happening on both sides. These bands of militia going around and burning down people's houses if they thought they were supporting the other side, and trying to chase each other, and assassinations, and really terrible things. What I like about this map is where it's really great over on Fordham Heights isn't, they just didn't know over here, so it's literally the blank spot on the map. Later on, of course, we start to fill that in. There's a wonderful set of U.S. coastal charts for the New York City region. They start in the 1830s and 40s, and then get repeated again in the 1850s and 60s, and then the 1870s and 80s, and then into the early 20th century. And so here we're actually getting something that's detailed enough that we can really start to work with it. So this is City Island. These lines here are contour lines, 10-foot contour lines. You can actually get an idea of how high the hills are. This is the hill over around Fordham Street where the Nautical Museum is, up at the top of the hill. And then this is the hill that I sort of informally call Schofield Street. I live on Schofield Street, so maybe I'm a little privileged to it. And you actually see a house that's labeled Schofield. This is from 1850, this map. So you can see there's very beginnings of Schofield Street, and then one house at Schofield Street, which is right on top of the hill. Which if you actually come over to Schofield Street, you'll see that the big house that's at Schofield and William is pretty much right on top of the hill, just as it's marked here. I also want to show you this. It's a little, I'll show you in a bit, but there's a little valley here, which is sort of where the school is and coming across Ambrosini Field and then up to the avenue. And if you walk over there, you actually see, there's been a lot of landfill, but you can actually see there still is a little bit of a declivity there that comes down. And then over here is a much larger wetland, which still has a little bit of remnant in the Tier Street wetlands in this part of the island. And then you can see the sandy beaches around the island and little piles of rocks. There's Rat Island and Green Flat. Um, these maps were made for navigation purposes, so they actually put some care. Particularly depends on the cartographer, the kind of care. You can see it's a little steeper on the west side of the island than it is on the east side of the island, the bay side versus the sound side. There's another resurvey of the map just a year later from 1851, and it shows a little bit more clearly a little tidal stream here, this wetland, this other wetland over around the school. And then you can see what's going on out here is their depths, the depths under the water, the bathymetric elevations, and then they've contoured it here. And there's even some notes about, where it's a soft bottom or a hard bottom, so forth and so on. These coastal charts are really beautiful, beautiful pieces of work. Really quite lovely. Big Tom down here. And then, go a little further. So that's the 1850s. Here's one from the 1890s. So this is from the Metropolitan Atlas of New York City. So this isn't so much this isn't from the nautical perspective. This is more from the land perspective. You can see those wetlands at Tier Street. You can see the other ones here have been filled in at this point. You can see Hart Island is starting to take a shape that's more similar to what we're used to seeing. You can see these wetlands that are still coming through Turtle Bay or Turtle Cove, and connecting all the way through to where Glover's Rock was right here on the road. How open Pelham Bay is. You can see Hunter's Island as an actual island, and Twin Islands is actual twin islands, not something that you could just walk to. You have to take a boat over to. Danny Hat Island and so forth. And this isn't so long ago. This is 1891, so this is what, 130 years ago. Yeah, so that's the same. And then this is the last one I'll show you, but this is Tipman's, which is the last series of coastal charts that were done. This is from 1907. And you can see they're starting, City Island is finally starting to build up and get some buildings, but still nothing like the number of buildings that are on the island today. Okay, so that it's using these kind of sources, and this isn't an exhaustive set. This is just some exemplary ones that allows us to derive the digital elevation model like this. And I'm just going to zoom out for a minute because and talk a little bit about the geological history. City Island is a kind of recessional moraine from the last glaciation. So we come down here into Queens and Brooklyn. You see this line of hills that come across Western Long Island and onto Staten Island. This is the terminal moraine of the Wisconsin Glacier that was here that reached this point about 21,000 years ago. And what you get at the front of a glacier is you get this sort of pile of hills, this pile of debris as the ice is moving, and as it melts in the front, it just dumps everything that it's carrying. So, and eventually, if that happens long enough, you get a series of hills, and that's this line of hills here, which is a really important set of ecological features for the city. It means that the land south of that wasn't glaciated. At least in the last glaciation, and not in actually the previous glaciation. So the soils out in Jamaica Bay are hundreds of thousands of years old, whereas everything behind this line is only 20,000 years old. The glacier, it stopped, and then when it started to retreat, it started to melt. It left a dam that was right here. The moraine continued across the Narrows. And so for a long time, this was all a lake. Where we think of New York Harbor, and it actually drained first out through out through here, through the Arthur Kill and around Staten Island this way. And then about 19,000 years ago, there was a dam, an ice dam. It was right here at the Narrows. Sorry, not at the Narrows, at Hellgate. And when the ice finally retreated from here, it exposed it. And when it exposed it, it created this massive waterfall where this lake that in the geological literature it's called Glacial Lake Albany, extended all the way to Albany. And it's about 6 meters higher than the modern sea level. So a lot of Manhattan was underwater, a lot of Brooklyn, Queens was underwater with fresh water, not salt water, fresh water. And then all that water from that lake poured out this direction through the East River, carving out a series of waterfalls here, here, and here, out through this way, and then out into Long Island Sound, which wasn't a sound at that point. It was a lake too. There was another glacial lake out here, and all this water came roaring out this way and carved out this gouge that's still there in the Sound today. So eventually the glacier kept moving. It stopped a while. So, and you actually kind of see it. So this is the terminal moraine. There's a recessional moraine that's sort of this line of hills here that wraps around Murray Hill and in Manhattan. And then another line of hills are moraine, which is Hart Island, City Island, Throgs Neck, and Ferry Point, and these places in the South Bronx. And that's why when we dig in our gardens here on City Island, what do you find? But all kinds of boulders and cobbles and pebbles and things that are all kind of rounded, and they're rounded because they were brought here and delivered here by a river of ice. And if you actually look at them, they're often really different geologic materials. And that's our City Island. It's a remnant of the last glaciation, maybe 15,000 years old. So and so if you look at the superficial geology, which is here, oops, put this on. You can actually see that this sort of pink color are glacial deposits, and this yellow color is the outwash sediments from that lake, the old lake bed, the old glacial lake bed. And then deeper under that, of course, is the old bedrock geology, which I can talk about if you like. So we take maps like this and the topography, and then we combine that to make maps of the soil types. And I'm not going to talk to you any depth about the soil types, but you can see there's several different soil types. This valley, this sort of central valley of City Island, would be historically one kind of soil type, and then you'd have a different kind of soil type up on the two sets of hills here. And then you get all these sort of marine derived and salt marsh derived soil types as you get into the water. There aren't too many streams right on City Island. There would just been a couple of ephemeral ones, at least as far as I know of. But there would have been many streams over here in Pelham Bay region. And this area around Pelham Bay was really important for the Lenape. Many sites for them. And these ones are probably only just a handful of the ones that were recorded either archaeologically or historically, so that I can actually document where they were. And you can see there have been several shell middens found on City Island, kind of in a row here, and then up here in the north, and then on High Island. And so probably, there's no evidence that I know of that the Lenape were permanent residents, or the Sawana were permanent residents. But on the other hand, they didn't really have permanent residences the way we do. They moved around a lot wherever they lived. And so it's really easy to imagine, a family or a couple of family groups coming, rowing their dugout canoe across, this little narrow space and landing here on City Island and setting up shop for a summer to collect the shellfish, to collect the oyster reefs, to maybe grow some food, and then maybe coming back to some of the larger encampments over here around Bartow Pell or on Rodman's Neck or on Hunter Island for the winter time. So anyway, so that's just a very rapid kind of quick look at some of the historical ecology work that we're doing. And I'll just end by showing you a few pictures These are all kind of works in progress, so they're not the best things. But so just to say, like, you know, we make these ecological maps, and they're really really complicated. They're like have so many polygons on them. It's a little hard to keep track. And then we sort of separate them out ecosystem by ecosystem, and then we use rendering software to basically fill in the pictures to, you know, take the topography, say, of the central part of the Bronx, and then fill in the kind of basic geography where the land is versus the water versus the salt marsh, and then fill those in with forest types that are appropriate to the different views. And this is how we can, you know, reconstruct an idea of what it looked like. So this is a like if you were flying in an airplane, this is what you might have seen 400 years ago. So this is the South Bronx. This is Rikers Island here, and over here is City Island and Hart Island, looking out toward the Sound. Here's a view looking toward Pelham Bay, right? So this is Hunter Island and Twin Island and Rodman's Neck and those marshes, and we're looking toward the west across the Bronx. And over here, you see the northern bit of City Island. And then finally, I don't know if this is going to work, but we made a little. We've been just starting to play around with video representations, and this is a rainstorm. Oops, let's see if this will work. So it doesn't have any sound. You have to provide your own sound. But it's trying to imagine Belden Point during a rainstorm 400 years ago. So imagine the oysters under the water right there. And that's about it. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen, and if anybody has any comments or questions, I'd love to talk to you about them.
Yes, does anybody have any questions? I have lots and lots, but I'm like to hear from others. Just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Well, I have a couple of questions. So on one of the maps that you showed, I saw that there was, I think this was a very early map. I forget the year, but I think it was from one of the British maps. It showed the East River, and then it showed the North River on top. So I was just wondering, I assume the North River in that map was the Hudson?
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the Dutch tended to call it the North River, and it was called that for a couple of centuries. It was only sort of later that that it was called the Hudson River. Yeah, yeah. It actually has many names. The Native American name, which is kind of hard to say, means the river that moves that flows both directions. You know, because the lower Hudson is a tidal estuary, right? You know, when the tides are coming, the water flows up into it, and then when the tide's going out, it flows the other way.
Yeah.
And one other question I had was about I had heard that the Native Americans considered oyster shells to be very spiritual and very powerful as far as you know, their spiritual sense, and that they used to make piles of oyster shells in front of their wigwams or their homes. And I just wondered if that was true or not.
I've not heard much about their spiritual importance, although they tell a lot of stories about that have oysters. But I think the reason why shell middens happen is because that's what they would do when the shells after they would eat the oyster is they would essentially put it in a big pile. And it's a good thing for us because, you know, oyster shells are very long lasting, and so they provide really important archaeological information. And you know, and archaeologists, you know, they very carefully will sift through them because you find all kinds of other things too. You'll often find pottery shards. You'll find you know, bones from the different other kinds of animals they were eating. Sometimes they do these cool flotation tests where they actually float water and they find like old corn kernels and that sort of thing. And sometimes there are burials too underneath the shell mounds. There's actually a really wonderful Lenape story that I tell that I retell in Mannahatta about how there was a community of people, and in this community there were a bunch of young people, and they were kind of disrespecting the gods. This is the way the story goes, and so the gods made all all the corn seed grow wings and fly away, right? Because the people are like, oh, we don't want to eat corn anymore. You know, we don't really care about the gods anymore. And so all the corn flew away, which I think is a beautiful metaphor for, you know, insects getting in your corn, and like, you know, you open up the bag. And there's even a little sort of side story, which is, you know, there was this couple, and the man wanted to see if they'd lost their corn or not, and his wife's like, no, no, don't look, that's disrespectful, just keep it closed. And he's like, no, I gotta look. And he looks, and he opens up, and all the seed fly away. So then one day the people are, you know, they're hungry because it's the middle of winter and now they don't have anything to eat. And this old man comes by from some other village, or maybe he's, you know, some sort of, you know, spiritual person. And he says, are you sorry? And the people say, yes, we're so sorry. We're so sorry. And we really want our corn back. And he says, okay, well, who is your best singer? And they nominate this one boy to go with him and to speak to Corn Woman about what happened to their corn. And so they walk out onto the ice, and he breaks the ice. He takes an oyster shell and he puts it on the end of the stick, and he breaks the ice with the oyster shell. And then he says to the boy, look down. And the boy's scared, like, I know it's cold, I don't want to do that. And he says, no, it's okay, look down. And the boy puts his head down through the ice, and he sees there's this beautiful world that's Corn Woman's world. That's underneath the water. And the sun is shining, and they're beautiful, beautiful fields of corn, beans, and squash. So they go down there, and they walk around, and eventually they find Corn Woman. And Corn Woman comes and says, you've been disrespecting me. Why should I do anything for you? And the man and the boy, they give some gifts. They give tobacco, and the boy sings and he dances. And Corn Woman is so moved by how sad they are and the things they do that she starts to cry. And when she cries corn kernels. Which you look at, you know, they're tear-shaped, right?
Yeah.
And so she says, you know, take back, you know, my tears, and take it back to your village. You can have your corn again. But remember, you should always be respectful and humble about what you have.
That's great.
Yeah.
Eric, I have a question about about the Native Americans. The Siwanoi is often a term that's been set aside for Lenape, but you've used both, and they're two different peoples.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, most of the literature talks about them as you know, there's sort of kind of New England coastal Algonquin peoples, of which there's
Right.
several ones, and the ones that are the
Right.
closest here would be the Siwanoi, and then the Lenape would be the next culture.
Uh-huh.
But I, you know, it's not like, I don't know, the French and the Dutch or something. You know, they I don't think they had that same idea. And we
Yeah.
know that later in time, you know, like in the Dutch period, the Siwanoi would, you know, move down and spend time like in Hunts Point and over alongside you know, and Ronnequa, like down in the very South Bronx, opposite Harlem. So yeah, it's a little bit, you know, it's really hard to say like what were the relationships before the Europeans here, because there's no records of that sort of thing.
Uh-huh.
So I usually say Siwanoi for people kind of east of the Bronx River, and Lenape for the rest. And then it's a similar kind of thing on Long Island. You know, you have the Lenape, you have the Canarsie and the Matinecock, and then the
Right.
Shinnecock, which are further east. They're probably more associated with the people of Connecticut and Rhode Island. But again, in ways that are really difficult to sort out.
Mhm.
They all spoke Algonquin-based languages, which, you know, I didn't know this until I started. But you know, the Algonquin languages, that's also the language family of the Fox and the Sioux, or not the Sioux, the Sox, the Saux in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and also the Blackfeet out in Montana. These are all Algonquin-speaking
Yeah.
languages. It's a really interesting language group. It's actually one of the widest spread Native American language groups in North America. So there's a lot of, you know, sort of early literature that talks about the Lenape being those sort of ancient ones, that they're somehow more respected. And if you talk to Algonquin linguists, they'll say that like the Muncie version of Lenape in some ways seems to be like the most, you know, the most kind of rudimentary of the languages, so the sort of purest, and then other ones have derived from it.
We don't know what Minnowitz comes from, or Minneford.
No, I mean, there's, you know, some people say it's a Lenape name, or a Siwanoi name, Algonquin name. Other people say maybe it has something to do with Peter Minuit.
That's
you know, another
been discounted, I think. Yeah.
Another name is, Miniford's Island or Minowitz, but
Mhm.
that could be derived from it. City Island is, as you well know, Barbara, it's had many, many names over the
Yes. Oh,
course of
yes,
time. Yeah. So,
indeed. Thank you.
sure.
You mentioned before the wampum. What did they make the wampum from? Was it shells, or did they? The reason why I grew up on City Island and I found something that I still treasure: little girl digging in the dirt on City Island, and it's a little stone with some scratching. I can't identify the language, but it
Yeah.
evidently was strung on something because there's holes to put it
Wow.
through, some sort of a cord. And I'd
Wow.
love to know more about that. That's with all the nice jewelry I've obtained over my life, that's one of my favorite things. And where would I go to find out anything about that?
Yeah, that's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. Um, yeah, that usually it's thought that it was the greater quahog, which is the sort of larger clam shells,
Yeah,
and where the muscle of the clam attaches to the shell,
yeah,
often leaves a little purple spot. So they would make white wampum and purple wampum.
from that. Uh-huh.
Yeah, and originally it was literally ground with an awl. You would like sharpen a piece of bone, and you would go like this. There are estimates that it would take 1,000 hours to make a bead, because
Oh,
you'd have to carve it out one direction to get it out of the shell, and then you'd have to carve, if you wanted to string it, you would have to carve another hole through the middle of it. You
yeah.
can just imagine how much work that is,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
So when I mentioned this just very briefly, when the Dutch came, they saw these things, and they saw that the wampum that was made in this part of the world was traded all over the Northeast, right? It was used by the Iroquois, up to the Haudenosaunee, up to the
Uh,
in central New York State, and the Susquehanna down Pennsylvania and out that direction. It was traded a long, long way away, because it was so valuable. Um, so the
huh.
Dutch saw that, and they thought, oh, I see, that's your money. And they actually, the Dutch had a problem. They didn't have much currency in the beginning. And so they actually adopted wampum for a number of decades as a kind of currency. And then they would, to facilitate the construction, they would give iron tools. And you can imagine, like, if you've been like making wampum with a bone for your whole life, and then someone actually gave you a steel drill,
Yeah.
like, you could make a lot more
Yeah.
wampum.
So wow.
Yeah. There's a great book called Changes on the Land by Bill
Oh,
Cronin, who's a very important environmental historian, and he talks about all the things that happen when the kind of Native American cultures in this part of the world came into contact with the
yeah.
Europeans,
Mm.
and it was corrosive in a whole bunch of different ways. I mean, like, this whole idea, like, of money, if you have to think about it, it's a little bit crazy, right? Like, for the Lenape, there was no way to save up wealth except in terms of your relationships with each other, right? Like, say you were really lucky hunting one day and you brought back a deer. What would you do with it? You can't eat a whole deer before it rots, right? So what would you do is you would share the parts to other people in your community, in the idea that they would do the same thing for you, right, later on, right? Or
Right.
if you had 40 deerskin cloaks, there's no point having 40 deerskin cloaks, because A, you can't wear them all at once, and B, you're going to pick up and you're going to carry everything you own 2 or 3 times during the course of the year, right?
Right.
And you can only carry so many things.
Yeah.
So, and they just didn't have the concept of a bank account, which can, like, accumulate wealth infinitely, right? Like, nobody tells you that there's a limit on the maximum size of your bank account, right?
Right.
That was this European idea. And so what had happened was, and this is true for hunter-gathering cultures all over the world, but before the Europeans came, the best thing you could do in your society was to take care of each other, right? And there were all these, like the story I told, and all these cultural things to try and put you together, these sort of egalitarian kind of measures. The Lenape didn't have any kings, they didn't have any hierarchy. They had sachems, they had these leaders, but there was no elective process to nominate them. It was just whoever seemed to be the wisest. And so
Mm.
imagine you're like me, I'm in my 50s, and so you've lived your whole life the way you could, and now people think you're kind of, you have something to say and you're a wise person. um, and then the Dutch show up and they say to the young guy, like my son, if you go get me beavers, I'll give you this thing that you've never had before. I'll give you a I'll give you a steel drill. I'll give you a steel pot. I'll give you a gun. I'll give you liquor. You know, these things are like completely out of their experience. And, you know, I have to say, like, a iron pot is a much better pot than a ceramic pot, a clay pot, right? And, you know, a steel drill is better than a bone drill. And so it created this like shift in power in the culture in a very short order, where suddenly the young people who could kill as many beavers as possible or as many fur-bearing animals as possible, they had all the power. And the old people had nothing.
Huh.
And you can imagine how corrosive that would be in a society. And then, of course, you know, there were a whole series of wars that were started, you know, basically by the Dutch around here, and terrible reprisals, including, you know, right in our own neighborhood, like, you know, the story with Anne Hutchinson, and Anne Hook. So, and you know, it's a terrible, terrible story. And then, unfortunately for the Lenape and for the Samoanoy, it continued generation by generation by generation, and in a way is still manifested today.
Yeah.
So it's probably a
We
little
don't
more than I
know.
wanted to know.
We don't know what Thomas Pell paid for the 50,000 acres that he is said to have negotiated from the Lenape or from Anhook, I think.
Yeah, I don't know what the terms of payment
Yeah.
were. Yeah. And, you know, Palmer, of course, he's this interesting, or Pell is this interesting character because he's an Englishman on the
Mhm.
Dutch territory, right? And then when the English come, you know, he's in such a good place after 1664 to assert his rights here.
Yeah, I've read that the English throne, which was in disarray at that time, had actually instructed him to buy up as much land as possible to get the Dutch out. And of course, eventually he went and fought himself with them, and they did leave. Yeah.
Right. Why? In some of the other things I'm writing, I've been writing about, you know, writing about New York, like this term, New York, the city of New York. You know,
Yeah.
it comes from that. It comes from 1664 when James, the Duke of York, got a charter from his brother Charles II of England.
Mhm.
This is Charles II, who was the son of Charles I, who's the guy who got his head cut off for
Right.
insisting on the absolute right of kings, right?
Right.
And basically, you know, one day his brother gives him a piece of paper and says, "I give you all the land between the Delaware River and the Connecticut River and New England and Maine. So go and get it." And he sails across the ocean, or he didn't sail himself. He sent some of his henchmen across the ocean, and they sailed into the harbor. And they said to Peter Stuyvesant, "It's ours." And Peter Stuyvesant couldn't do anything, and he said, "Okay, it's yours." And that's what we call New York, right? That's why we call it
Right.
New York. And so every time, you know, I know none of us mean this, but when we say, like, I'm a New Yorker, I live in the city of New York, I live in the state of New York, in a way, we are giving credit to this guy, James, Duke of York, who never came here, who never knew anything. He sold New Jersey to settle a debt. Um, you know, he was kind of a bad person. He became James II of England, and in the end, the English kicked him off the throne, right?
Yeah.
Because he had these kind of royal pretensions like his father did. Um, not a good man, not somebody we should be celebrating, I think. And yet we do in every time we say New York.
Hmm. That's interesting.
Eric, can I ask just a quick question about the coast or the shoreline around City Island way back at when Henry Hudson was coming in 400 years ago? We've, you know, been surveying around City Island, finding little pockets of marshland. I'm just curious how, you know, how you envision it was, you know, way back when 400 years ago.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think like if we started out in the middle of Eastchester Bay, it would have been, you know, shallow estuarine conditions with some fresh water coming down the Hutchinson River. So, you know, as we've talked about, that probably would have been a good place for oysters back in the day. And then as you came to the beaches, it probably would have been sandy beaches, you know, along the shore. The kind of width of the beaches would depend a lot on the shape of the land right there. So the way the maps look to me, it was a little, you know, a little sharper, say on the bay side, like where I live. And that's pretty much what you see is these sort of narrow beaches. And then right up out of the high tide line, it would have become forest. And so mostly it would have been forest, except for the places where the Lenape were. And then there are these two kind of salt marsh complexes. One kind of in the, I guess, northwest corner of the island, up around where Tier Street is now, and then the other kind of where Ambrosini Field and the school is now, which is, you know, where there's that little pocket salt marsh that's still well, there's pocket salt marshes that remain in both places, right? Much smaller than the original extent, but they're still there. And actually, if you look in the, the cities, the city's done a lot of work after Hurricane Sandy to model where storm surge might go. And these places are the same places that would flood in a really bad hurricane situation on City Island, because they're still a little bit lower. And if you go and look carefully, you can actually tell that they're still a little bit lower than the land right around them. Yeah.
Yes, I've been in City Island and I've seen some old treasures from the Dutch in the area, back beach area. I've actually dove in that area, City Island. And I've a couple treasures under the water, like jewelry from the Dutch and things, and also oyster shells that the Dutch used.
Oh, wow.
And I've seen it on sound when I was diving in the back. So
wow, that's cool. That's cool.
See it underwater 20 feet.
Right.
Wow.
Well, that's the other thing is I think the water would have been so much clearer in the past, right?
Yeah.
That you would have been able to see right to the bottom around a lot of the shallower parts of City Island in the past. There's also, little records of wildlife. It's sort of hit and miss, but there's a story of a blue shark being caught off City Island in 1900. It's not a hard thing to imagine, small whales and porpoises, which, still seen occasionally around City Island. So, I think the kind of the imagination is the limit in terms of the kinds of wildlife that we might have seen here 400 years ago. And that's why, I'm so excited about the City Island Oyster Reef, project to try and bring back a little bit of that, at least in terms of the oysters.
Here.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. I have one tiny question, which is, do you know about the dugout holes that are over, it's on the road, Orchard Beach Road, between Bartow Circle and the Orchard Beach parking lot? If you walk back toward one of the little islands back there, which you can get to, there are these 4 or 5 holes that we've emptied leaves out, and everybody assumes that they were made by the Indians as probably cookings, maybe storage. Have you been to those? Have you seen them?
I actually haven't ever been myself. I'd love to go with you sometime, but I've read about them. There's a paper, there's a kind of obscure archaeological study of those potholes from 1964 by Ed Kaiser. He did a lot of work in the Pelham Bay Park region on the Lenape, Soanoy. Yeah, I can send you the paper, but yeah, I'd love to go and see them.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'd have to find them again, but yeah, there are people with the East Bronx History Forum that know how to get there.
Right.
And we cover them up carefully so nobody will actually do anything to them.
Right, destroy them. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's the thing. Like, this whole area. I mean, not so much City Island again, because it would have been a little bit of work to get out here, but the connected bits around Pelham Bay, pretty much what's modern day Pelham Bay Park, especially the northern half north of the bridge, was a really, really rich and very important Native American place. Yeah. Many sites. And I'm sure the sites that we know about are just a small handful of the actual number of sites.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I have a question about I heard different reasons why Rat Island was named Rat Island. Do you have any any insight to that?
I don't think I have any insights about that. What have you heard?
I've heard that there was because it was a point where boats would come in, and it was almost like there was this machine on the island that they called a rattler, which was something that they churned so that the boats could hear that there was land there, so they could divert from hitting the island, and it was called a rattler. So that's why I heard that it was called Rat Island.
I think most boats didn't come that way, though. They came on the other side of Hart Island. So I think that it's a nice story. We've also named for all those rats that were escaping from Hart Island prison too, but I don't. It's in a very old map from before prison, so I think Who knows? Maybe it had rats. Yeah.
Right. I like it though. Yeah, and green flats there too, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And blazes, blouses, and there's a whole bunch of them. Yeah.
Yeah. No nations, and the Cuban
Yeah.
ledge over here in Eastchester Bay, which the other day we were down at the beach at a really low tide, and you could see Cuban ledge just sticking out of the water.
That very low tide that we had about a month ago was unbelievable. That it was huge. Yeah.
It was huge, exactly. That's what I said to my son. I'm like, "What is that?" And then,
Yeah.
You can actually
looked like a landing strip.
It looked like a beach.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it probably was a beach actually,
Yeah.
if you were over there. Yeah.
Right.
There was some boat ran into Big Tom the other day during one of the they have these sailing races on Wednesday nights, and somebody wasn't watching and they ran right into it. So it still rears its ugly head when it has to.
That's right. You got to watch out for the rocks. It's important to know where they are.
Yeah.
In both literal and metaphorical senses.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for all your questions and comments and things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And please don't be shy. If you see me wandering around City Island, please introduce yourself.
Great.
Love to know you, and I look forward to really helping out however I can with the City Island oyster
We'll
reef.
get you. We'll get you.
We're looking to exploit you. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll get you.
Thank you very much, Eric.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Wonderful.
Good
Good night,
night.
William.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye. Thanks
Bye,
for coming.
everyone.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.